watch, pray, be ready. Jesus gave these instructions and this admonition to his disciples as found in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And today, through the lens of conflict and vulnerability. I know that many of you are familiar with these words, but we review them right now. From Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 and 5, Jesus stated, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many." Jesus repeated this again, this instruction this morning. "And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. If anyone says to you," Jesus repeats it again, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See," Jesus adds, "I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the desert,' do not go out. Or, 'Look, he is in their inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." Now that instruction that Jesus gave about do not go out into the desert, do not go into the inner rooms, do not be drawn in by great signs and wonders. Because as we study Matthew 24 and other passages of Scripture, when Jesus returns, his feet do not touch the ground. So anybody who claims to be Christ and their feet are touching the ground, we can know with a certainty that that is a misrepresentation. "The sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect." That very group whom the evil one would seek to deceive, the angels will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. Jesus states in this instruction, "He who endures to the end shall be saved." I've selected specific sound bites from Jesus in this Matthew 24 discourse to highlight how many times he talks about deceive. Be on your guard. Don't be deceived. False prophets are going to rise. They're going to perform things and go, "Wow, look at that." But don't believe it, he says. Be warned. Don't be drawn in by deception. The evil one will attempt to even deceive those who are elect. Do not believe it. Implies, all this warning about deception implies there is the reality of truth. Does it not? If there's a deception going on, there's a real on the other side. Also implies if there are false prophets, does that not imply the reality of a genuine prophet speaking on behalf of the Lord? Conflict and vulnerability is a very present reality for the end-time people of God. We have never known no conflict. You and I have never known no conflict. Two schoolboys duking it out on the playground. Not the playground, but a bus this week shows a horrible video of a 9-year-old being savagely beaten by older students on the bus. Conflict. Husband and wife arguing, trading harsh and bitter words. Dates back all the way to the Garden of Eden. Creator, it's that woman you gave me. that has caused all this problem. She gave me of the fruit, and I did eat of it. 2 football teams slamming each other into the ground. Conflict. Politicians trading accusations. I chose a graphic outside of our country so there would be no internal implications. If you recognize that, it comes from Great Britain. Conflict. One nation invades another nation to subjugate and control. Happens all the time. We have never known life without conflict. Conflict is a way of life for us in whatever arenas we find ourselves to be in. It can be at home, it can be at the workplace, it can be at the neighborhood, it can even be at church. At times, conflict is our entertainment, as we have noted. And conflict can also be our greatest fear. We have seen from Matthew this theme of conflict and vulnerability among God's end-time people as Jesus gave his instruction concerning the end times. We find a companion expose on conflict coming to us from the book of Revelation, and more specifically, Revelation chapter 12. In Revelation chapter 12, we are provided an overview of a 2,000-year time period within the space of just 17 verses. Many of you are familiar with Revelation 12, but just to give you some of the highlights once again, the vision there that John records displays a woman who is with child and soon to give birth. But then there's a dragon in the picture as well who is at the ready to devour the child that the woman will deliver. When the child is born, no details are given, but rather quickly in this vision, the child is caught up to God. The woman then flees into the wilderness for a time period of 1,260 days, prophetic days that is. In Revelation 12 and verses 7, the scene changes from what is happening upon the earth to now what is taking place in a heavenly arena. There is a war that breaks out. The 2 principal characters is an angelic being named Michael, and the other is identified as the great dragon, the devil and Satan. And that devil and Satan deceives and accuses the whole world. He is cast out of heaven, and the devil is angry because he knows that his has a short time. A voice then sounds from heaven. Salvation, strength, and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. The accuser of our brethren has been cast down. But they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. Now the devil has great wrath, as we've noted, because he knows that his time is short. The dragon then persecutes the woman. The woman flees into the wilderness. And at the end of the vision, this is what we read, that the dragon is enraged with the woman, and he goes off to make war with the remnant of her seed, meaning the rest of her offspring, and they are described with 2 characteristics: those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. This single chapter, as I mentioned, gives a 2,000-year overview of Christian history from the time of Jesus right down to our day as well. In both Matthew and Revelation, we have this theme of conflict and vulnerability. We believe that we are among those who are described as the remnant of her seed, those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. So I invite you to consider this question then. How do we live? How do we navigate conflict and vulnerability? In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus gave the warning. Do not be deceived. Do not be deceived. Even if there are great signs and wonders, do not be deceived. In Revelation 12, there is animosity, there is hostility, there is an agenda by the evil one to make life very, very difficult, vulnerable, and threatening to those who in loyalty want to keep God's commandments and to be mindful of the testimony of Jesus. We as Seventh-day Adventists believe that we respond to these identifying characteristics that we find in Revelation chapter 12. One of our beliefs states this: the universal church is composed of all who truly believe in Christ, but in the last days, a time of widespread apostasy, a remnant has been called out to keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. This remnant announces the arrival of the judgment hour, proclaims salvation through Christ, and heralds the approach of his second advent. In a scholarly work produced not all that long ago, about 10 years, this scholarly work entitled Toward a Theology of the Remnant, one contributor makes this observation: the application of the remnant concept to the Adventist church has at times produced strong reactions from other Christian communities against it. These groups have claimed that the remnant concept fosters an arrogant, exclusivist, and judgmental attitude toward the spirituality of others. In other words, it's the perception from those who are in other faith communities that we who are in the Seventh-day Adventist faith community, that we can have a tendency to be arrogant, exclusivist, and judgmental toward others. That is not a comfortable assessment for us to deal with. But I think that there is an element of reality to that. However, it is conditioned somewhat by how one approaches the prophecies in Daniel Revelation as a whole. Some of you are aware of this, some of you are not. But there are 4 primary manners in which students of Daniel and Revelation approach prophecy. One is known as preterism. If you think of the prefix pre, it means something before. And preterism simply refers to what is past. And so those who look at primarily the book of Revelation through the lens of preterism believe that it has already been all fulfilled and was completely realized up until about the 400s. And therefore, there is no relevance in Revelation for us today. That is a prophetic framework of preterism, and it is held by a number of Christian communities. And so Revelation doesn't even really factor into their experience today. Another viewpoint, another framework is idealism. Idealism is the thought that Revelation doesn't have any specific time relevance at all. It is simply symbolic of what may be happening on a cyclical basis throughout history. But you can't really identify any one period of time as being a fulfillment of its prophecies. Idealism. And there are some Christians who follow that framework. Another is futurism. Futurism takes the book of Revelation, specifically from chapter 4 onward, and views chapter 4 primarily through chapter 20 as something that has not taken place at all. It's all in the future. In fact, this particular viewpoint dovetails with those who believe in the secret rapture And the idea that the church is going to be lifted up and out of this world before anything in Revelation 4, 5, 6, and onward even take place. And so for a person who approaches Revelation in that manner, hey, we're not even going to be around, so it doesn't really matter. Then there is the approach called historicism. As Seventh-day Adventists, we embrace the viewpoint of historicism. And that is that Revelation has been fulfilling throughout time from the day that John was first given the visions and has progressed down through the centuries to our time today. So how one views the book of Revelation conditions one as to how they would understand Revelation 12:17 about the remnant of her seed. For most Christians, it's not even a relevant issue. So therefore, we've got these Seventh-day Adventist believers over here who think that they've got something special, but they don't even have the foundation to evaluate it. Are you tracking with me? Now, that's an external understanding of how others view the book of Revelation. In recent weeks, we have been focusing upon young adults, and we wouldn't make it exclusively to young adults, but primarily young adults who have been leaving the church. We've called that series Mind the Gap. And Mind the Gap has some interrelation today with Watch, Pray, and Be Ready. And if you've been here in recent weeks, you know that there was a survey that was done primarily among those who were somewhere around 20 years of age, up to 45. And out of those 700 that responded who have left the church, the question was asked, why did you leave? And the answer was given, because of doctrinal disagreements. They no longer believe some of the things that the church teaches, that the Seventh-day Adventist Church embraces. And one of those that was primarily of disagreement was that the Adventist church is the last day remnant church. What we looked at last week in the Mind the Gap series is a cultural context in which this has taken place. That we live in a time called a postmodern psyche, where there are no absolutes. Everything is relative. There is no ultimate truth. It is characterized by uncertainty and skepticism and plurality. Everyone can just latch on to whatever subjective belief that they feel comfortable with. This is the water that we live in. This is the air that we live in. And more so are young adults than those of us who are in the boomer category or who are in the WW2 category from a demographic standpoint. So with our young adults, I am concluding that there is a loss of identity. There is a confusion about identity as Seventh-day Adventist young adults. Or maybe they do understand, and for whatever reason, they no longer want to identify. So I ask the question again, how do we live? How do we navigate in this ongoing experience of conflict and vulnerability? I want to suggest to you that Jesus is the prototype of the remnant. Embrace that. Jesus is the prototype of the remnant as described in Revelation 12:17. Now, a prototype is an original model on which something is patterned. And we find that this term is actually used in one of Paul's letters. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15, in reference to Jesus, we read that he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. And that term for firstborn is prototokos. That is a biblical term in the Greek language, and it's the word from which we get prototype, that Jesus is the prototype over all creation. Now, if we look at Jesus as being the prototype of the remnant, we find that our connection with Jesus is absolutely indispensable. In that same book that I referenced a few moments ago, Towards a Theology of the Remnant, Angel Manuel Rodriguez makes these observations. Jesus Christ is the truest remnant. In him we find a person who was absolutely faithful to God under the most difficult circumstances and who was able to overcome the forces of evil. Remember, from Revelation 12:17, the evil one, the devil, makes war against the remnant of her seed, persecutes them. Jesus endured persecution that none other has superseded with. In his life and ministry, Jesus recapitulated the experiences not only of Adam, but also the people of God. Where Adam failed, Jesus overcame. He was the servant of the Lord par excellence. In his own person and through his sacrificial death, God was to preserve for himself a remnant. And since Christ permanently took on himself human nature, we could argue that even if the totality of the human race were to reject the salvation he had obtained for them, the race would not be extinguished from the universe. God would have preserved it in the person of his Son as a human being. Are you catching the significance of this? If Christ is to be identified as the true and faithful remnant, then the identity of the eschatological remnant. Eschatological is simply a term that refers to end time. The identity of the eschatological remnant is fundamentally related to the person and work of Christ. This remnant constitutes the true people of God by virtue of their union with him. So how did Jesus deal with conflict and vulnerability? He was certain about his identity. He was certain about his identity. This is just a sample of texts. John chapter 1. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. John chapter 8. The religious leaders confront Jesus. Do we not rightly say that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Can you catch the emotional impact of that accusation? In Matthew chapter 12, this fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of demons. I mean, what an insult. We don't even believe you have a legitimate divine origin, Jesus. Jesus' identity was continually assaulted. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus is having a conversation with his followers, and he asks them the question, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And they reply, well, some say John the Baptist, and some Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or, we've even heard that some don't even associate with one of those three greats. You're just one of the prophets. And then Jesus responds to them personally, but who do you say that I am? You've told me what you hear, but who do you say that I am? And Peter speaks on his own conviction as well as speaking for his companion disciples. You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus begins to drop a bombshell on them that they really weren't prepared for. From that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the third day. And when they heard that, they go, oh, no, Jesus, far be it from you. This shall not happen to you. And Jesus responds, get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men. So, one moment, you're the Son of God. And the next moment, get behind me, Satan. You are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men. Because in that response, oh, no. Far be it from you, Jesus. This shall not happen. Suffering and mistreatment. Oh, no. That's not in your future. In our thinking. And there was an echo in Jesus' memory of the temptation of the evil one out in the wilderness. If you'll just worship me, all these kingdoms of the world will be yours. And so Jesus' identity was assaulted continually by the religious leadership of his day. And he was misunderstood by his followers. And yet Jesus had this rock-solid identity of who he was. And it's what enabled him to keep stepping forward in his mission. So, the question comes to my mind, if he was that certain about his identity, where did that come from? Where did he get his certainty with his identity? He got it from prophecy. In Mark chapter 1, verse 15, Mark presents Jesus as entering into the broader public phase of his ministry, and Jesus proclaims, the time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God is at hand. It's near. Repent and believe in the gospel. And when Jesus said the time is fulfilled, we see in that a reference back to Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, which gives the prophecy of the 70 weeks and focuses upon the Messiah, the Prince. So as Jesus looked at that prophecy from Daniel chapter 9, and he thinks about who he is, I'm the fulfillment of prophecy. I'm the one that Daniel pointed forward to. This is just one example. In Matthew chapter 12, we have 3 statements of Jesus that kind of give this overarching summary of who he saw himself to be. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. A little controversy went on with the religious leaders about what to do and what not to do on the Sabbath. And Jesus settles that. Well, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. I made it, And then a little bit later, they're asking, well, can you give us a sign that would validate who you are? And Jesus, well, I'll give you a sign. You won't see it right now, but you will. As Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. And that sign did validate his claim. In verse 42, he says, a greater one than Solomon is here. So Jesus saw himself as the culmination of everything that the Old Testament pointed forward to. In Luke chapter 24, as he's on that hike from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and he gets into a dialogue, kind of incognito, with a couple of his little bit more distant followers. He plays as though he doesn't really know what's going on, and they say, are you the only one in Jerusalem who doesn't know? Our hopes have been centered upon this Jesus. And then we read that beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures things concerning himself. Jesus saw himself as the fulfillment of prophecy. Even on the cross, when he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That was actually a fulfillment of what we read in Isaiah 53. He was to be smitten of God. The suffering servant was to be afflicted because the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. So if Jesus had a certainty about his identity, which grew out of prophecy, and if Jesus is the quintessential remnant, how can we then be certain of our identity as the remnant today? Because our identity arises out of blank. What's the answer? Prophecy. Revelation chapter 12, in 2 instances, it gives this prophetic time period. One identified as the 1,260 days, and the other under the terminology of a time, times, and a half a time. Now, if you're not familiar with that, I highly recommend that you're here every week at 10:30 because this topic will come around in the cycle. Our identity arises out of prophecy just as Jesus' identity arose out of prophecy. If we do not have a strong identity of who we are prophetically, we are going to be open to all sorts of influences and voices. A few weeks ago, we thought about what would be coming possibly down the road in 2023. We can be pretty certain that the climate crisis will continue to be ongoing. There will be going to be international conflicts. There's going to be continued economic and financial stress. Certain voices, significant voices in the public domain are already predicting the next pandemic. We looked at that. Catastrophic contagion set in the near future, thought to be having a higher fatality rate than COVID-19 and disproportionately affecting children and young people. If you've been listening at all to voices that are cultural watches, you have heard more about central bank digital currency. If we don't know who we are going to be left vulnerable to the voices around us and how easy it may become to just go along to get along. And some of you are confronted with your identity from your own family. As you have stepped out into a broader, deeper understanding of prophetic biblical truth, and your family thinks, you are crazy. Why are you doing this? I just want to remind you that throughout the Gospel of John, periodically, John notes that as Jesus did miracles and he made statements, there were some who believed and some who did not. And if you're in-house today or you're in-house on media and you're embracing this, you are part of that group who are believing. Be thankful for it. Rejoice in it. So how did Jesus deal with conflict and vulnerability? He was certain about his identity. And then secondly, he continually engaged in inclusive ministry. He continually engaged in inclusive ministry. And this is a little bit of an echo from last week. How Jesus was inclusively exclusive. How he ministered and he reached out and he responded to the entire cross-section of culture, from the wealthy and the educated, to the downcast and the outcast, to the people who were not inside the Jewish community, to Roman centurions who were willing to believe in his ability to heal their employee, their servant. And Jesus said of that one, I have not found such a great faith in all Israel. Jesus highlighted those who were the object of cultural prejudice of his day, those who had value, those who could serve and minister, as he uplifted the Samaritans. Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners, and he also responded to invitations for dinner with a Pharisee. Jesus' ministry was inclusive, tax collectors and sinners and Pharisees and military Roman officers and scribes and women and men. So how did Jesus deal with conflict and vulnerability? He continually engaged in inclusive ministry. And he did everything he could to validate others who recognized him. Here's an example. In Luke chapter 9, the disciples, kind of acting like tattletales on someone who is not nearby, would say, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he doesn't follow with us. He's not a part of our group. And Jesus replies, well, don't forbid him, for he who is not against us is on our side. God is doing things in the lives of other people outside of our community that we don't fully understand. But we trust that he is doing things in other faith communities based on this one statement from Jesus. In John chapter 10, Jesus says, other sheep I have which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. God has his people in other faith communities, and we need to affirm and validate and encourage wherever we can people who are following Jesus according to their understanding. In Revelation chapter 18, that prophetic call is to come out of Babylon. And he specifically says, come out of her, my people. I have a lot of people who are in these other communities. Come out, come out. Jesus was inclusive, opening his arms to all. Going back to John chapter 10, Jesus testifies of his good works, his ministry that he has been engaged in. In John chapter 10, in this dialogue he has with religious leadership, he states this, many good works I have shown you from my Father. For which of these do you stone me? And the reply comes, well, for a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, and because you being a man made yourself God. Yeah, I know who I am. But they did not refute the fact that he had many good works. And when people see us as authentically serving both inside and outside of our community, and they see that genuineness, it will be an attraction to what we have found in the Scriptures. How did Jesus deal with conflict and vulnerability? He was certain about his identity. He was right on time with prophecy. And he continually engaged inclusively in ministry. Revisiting that statement from Dr. Rodriguez, if Christ is to be identified as the true and faithful remnant, then the identity of the end-time remnant is fundamentally related to the person and work of Jesus. This remnant constitutes the true people of God by virtue of their union with him. Now, in a future week, we're going to continue to look at some of the aspects of the remnant. But consider right now that we can be a Sabbath keeper and yet not vitally in union with Jesus. In fact, all those who provided such conflict and actually were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus were Sabbath keepers. But they were not in union with Jesus. We can know a lot about the Scriptures. We can have the testimony of prophecy in our midst, but if it does not connect us with Jesus, something is missing. So today I invite you to unite with Jesus. To affirm, to reaffirm your union with Him. Be solidified in your identity as having arisen out of prophecy. And say, Lord, how do you want me to be an extension of your character to others?